I'm Rochelle Carey. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your look at the world of business and economics. This week, famines of biblical proportions. The coronavirus has upended the global economy and supply chains with nations under lockdown. So what does it mean for food supplies? From the richest nation where low-paid farm workers fear they could be victims of the pandemic to one of the poorest nations, Zimbabwe, and its need for food aid. As Italy and Spain start the tentative process of lifting the lockdown, can the European Union finalize a €1 trillion plan to revive the economy? From health crisis to food crisis, the coronavirus is upending the world as we know it. The United Nations World Food Program is warning of multiple famines of biblical proportions as tens of millions are plunged into starvation. Long before the pandemic, the agency had been warning world leaders that 2020 would bring the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. An estimated 135 million people face starvation, and that could double to 265 million by the end of the year. It blames the perfect storm, war in Yemen and Syria, natural disasters, and changing weather patterns. At particular risk are refugees and informal workers. For example, it's estimated that about 136 million people in India working in the non-agriculture sector are at immediate risk of losing their jobs. The World Food Program has called for $365 million, but only a quarter of that has been received so far. With more than 2 billion people under lockdown, supply chains have been disrupted. And that's not just in the emerging and developing markets. The rapid collapse of economic activity has led to more than 26 million people applying for unemployment benefits in the United States. 1 in 7 Americans relied on food banks before the pandemic. It has now doubled or tripled, according to food charities. And yet farmers are destroying produce, dumping milk, and culling livestock, despite grocery stores struggling to stock their shelves. You have 2 reports from our correspondents in the richest nation and one of the poorest. In a moment, Al Jazeera's Hera Matassa is in Zimbabwe, where half the population needs food aid. But first, Rob Reynolds is in California looking at the plight of poorly paid essential workers who are crucial to getting food onto the nation's tables.
Strawberries are ripening in the fields, waiting to be picked. But for farm workers like Maria, harvest time is a season of fear.
I am afraid of getting sick because if I don't recover, I will die. So I would leave 4 children in the orphanage. I am obviously afraid, but I have to work.
Maria, who is undocumented and asked that her surname not be used, is one of an estimated 3 million farm workers in the U.S. All are considered essential workers, like doctors, nurses, and law enforcement. But unlike them, they are paid low wages, have fewer legal protections, and many lack protective gear.
Farm workers seem to be at the bottom of the line, the last in line. People don't think about them. They don't think about the protections that they need.
Farm workers as a group are already among the least healthy in society.
Poverty, lack of access to basic medical care, high rates of diabetes, hypertension, and lung problems from exposure to pesticides means that farm workers are at high risk of becoming extremely ill or dying if they get coronavirus.
A coronavirus flare-up among farm workers could spread like wildfire.
Be extremely difficult to prevent the spread if there's a major outbreak in the agriculture industry. Even one outbreak among, say, one careless farm labor contractor can cause an outbreak among the whole industry.
Many farm operators do allow workers to practice social distancing, for example, by working alternate rows of crops. But the pay structure discourages stringent hygiene.
Many workers are being paid piece rate per box of flat of strawberries they pick. 20 seconds washing your hands can feel endless, especially if you're waiting in line during a break and want to get back out there in the fields to pick more.
California and a handful of other states have laws providing unemployment insurance and compensation for injuries on the job to farm workers.
In all of the other states of the United States of America, farm workers do not have disability insurance. They do not have unemployment insurance.
For workers like Maria, working from home obviously isn't an option. And even staying home while sick is an impossible luxury.
I'm the only person in my family that is earning an income. So for me, it's either you work or you don't eat.
The They are essential workers putting food on the country's tables every day. Yet somehow they remain invisible and vulnerable.
Most Zimbabweans are already struggling to put food on the table. These women are grateful for any kind of assistance. Years of drought, rising inflation, and now coronavirus have seen food prices soar. Several families are now eating less. Many say they know not much will change until lockdown restrictions are eased or scrapped in early May.
We know the virus is killing people, so we are waiting for that to eat. And we are not doctors, we are not nurses, we are not whatever. So we are waiting for what? We're waiting for that 2 weeks to get finished. After it's finished, we will see what is going to happen next.
The World Food Programme says half of Zimbabwe's population needs food aid. A poverty assessment done by the government and aid agencies last year found nearly 80% of families in urban areas are hungry. Local milling companies tried to cope with what's available. The pandemic has made it difficult to buy more grain from abroad.
Some of these countries are on lockdown. It's not an export ban, but what it's simply done is that the infrastructure, the whole system of exporting is now ceased to operate. Also, some of the ships that are bringing consignment this side are now subjected to quarantine every station they arrive. So this has slowed down the importation of grain.
1 meter,
Families in rural areas are also struggling. The rains have been erratic. Many haven't managed to grow much food. Now the global health crisis is making more families here vulnerable. Priority is given to the sick and the elderly, and even here people are being encouraged to practice social distancing, but masks and gloves and hand sanitizers are in short supply, and that's the case all over the country. Zimbabwe's unofficial unemployment rate is more than 80%. Most people live hand to mouth. The government says vulnerable households will receive cash transfers over the next 3 months. That's less than $10 per person every month. Businesses have been told by the state not to increase the prices of basic commodities. But in previous years, whenever an official price freeze was imposed, it led to panic buying, shortages, and even more frustration.
While rich nations have the financial muscle to see themselves through this crisis, it's the low-income and developing nations that could see past economic gains disappear. Let's bring in Maximo Torero to discuss all this. He's the chief economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization. He joins us via Skype from Rome. We appreciate your time so much. What is your biggest fear about the ability to feed people during this crisis?
Thank you very much for the kind invitation. Our biggest fear is not food availability, it's food access. What it means, food availability means that food is available in the markets, and what we are seeing in the case of staple commodities, which are capital intensive on the key exporting countries, is that food is available and the logistical problems are starting to be resolved. And the few countries that put export restrictions, they are moving backwards. Yesterday, even Vietnam moved backwards and out of the export quota in the case of rice, which will come down that market. In the case of wheat and corn and soybeans, the markets are okay because there is significant stocks and a very good harvest this year. The problem is on the recession and how the recession, as a consequence of the process of the COVID-19 lockdowns, will affect the poorest economies and how much access to resources they will have to procure the food they need. And this is especially binding for native food importing countries, like the small islands, which are affected severely because of tourism reduction, because of remittances reduction, because of their net food importers, and because of climate shock. They are very vulnerable. And the same for sub-Saharan African countries, which many of them are in food crisis, and they are being affected also because of oil, the key oil exporting countries like Nigeria, Chad, Libya, and also because they are primary exporters of commodities that will lower their demand because of the economic recession in the developed countries.
So there's not a shortage of food, is basically what you're saying. The issues are much more complicated. It's not about not having enough food. It's about being able to get it to the places where it needs to be.
Exactly. Is able to have the income to be able to get the food. And of course, there will be some logistical problems. Still, we have logistical problems on high value commodity, fresh fruits and vegetables. But the major concern is If you look at Africa, for example, okay, where we have the majority of the food crisis countries, where Africa exports their commodities. So the key exports of Africa go to the Netherlands, to France, to Spain, to the United States, to Germany, and to the UK. All those countries are facing significant recession. So their demand for those commodities that they export that gives them revenue will be affected. All the oil exporting countries will reduce significantly their demand because of the low oil prices we're facing. The same for cotton. If you look at the countries where cotton is exported in Africa, the case of Mali, for example, all the contracts or many of the contracts of cottons are canceled because companies expect that the demand for clothes will be lower. So that's what makes this continent very vulnerable because the revenue income from the activities, the economic activities on primary exporting they do, will be significantly affected by the recession. So that's our major concern right now, how we increase the resilience to be able to cope with the slowdown of the economy, which we don't know if it will be 12 months or more, so that when the economy recovers, they are okay. But that requires giving them support, liquidity, so that they can cope with those 12 to 18 months of recession.
Will there be, price increases?
Right now, we only observed some price increases in the case of rice, in the staple commodities, which our expectation is that it will start to slow down and go to the regular levels because, as I mentioned yesterday, Vietnam stopped the export restriction, the quota that they had on rice. And this is because rice is a very thin market. So this is Thai rice. So this will be now resolved and the price should go down. All the other staple commodities prices are stable and down. In the case of the high value commodities, we are observing in Africa, especially, some increases in certain countries. And mostly this is happening in countries with other problems, like in the case of Sudan, for example, because of the conflict zones and the difficulties to move and difficulties for support to come in. So that's where there is where we are observing some changes, important changes in prices that we need to see carefully because this could increase food insecurity. But again, the major concern is, do these people, these farmers, will have income? Remember, they will be facing lower prices of what they sell. And that's what we are concerned. And that's one of the options we are trying to push in the case of Africa, is how we can accelerate inter-regional trade as a way to create a new demand that will allow them to cope with this period of recession from the northern part of the world.
A lot of what you're describing is happening, obviously, because of these lockdowns that so many countries are having that could either be described as drastic or necessary or both. Whatever the case, they are what they are. Do you think that enough politicians and leaders really understood what the effect of these lockdowns could be when it comes to the supply chain and it comes to food?
I think that if you look at what happened 2 months ago when the lockdowns started, nobody was talking about food. The priority was health, which is correct. This is a health problem. But I think that has changed substantially. People are now really concerned about food. Food is becoming a priority sector. So many countries are developing health guidelines to assure that the value chain is kept alive, which is where we have been talking significantly with every person we can, so that this is important. I think we cannot see health and food independently to each other. There is no way you can have health if you don't have appropriate food, especially in the most vulnerable populations. So I think now there is a big change in the way this is being seen, and many countries are putting in place policies to declare food as an essential sector. But of course, we need to keep the health measures in place in those sectors. So it's not just declaring an essential sector. We need to be sure that the workers are safe and that they have all the protective measures, the physical distance, and the masks and the gloves, and if possible, testing. That will be the best option. But we need to do it correctly.
Absolutely. They are most certainly essential workers. If we didn't know that before, we certainly know it now. Maximo Torero, the chief economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization, thank you very much, sir.
A pleasure.
Now, the spread of the virus among workers at meat processing plants has raised concerns of food shortages. But President Donald Trump passed an order to keep them open, and that has been criticized by unions and some investors. Maria Latini is the executive director of FAIR, a $20 trillion investor group, and managed to catch up with Maria and asked why she thought Trump's decision was sowing the seeds of future pandemics.
We have seen diseases spread previously. There's been studies in Iowa, there's been studies in Pennsylvania and South Carolina that show that actually workers in these processing plants are 6 times more likely to encounter bacteria resistant to antibiotics, for example, such as MRSA. So we already have cases that show that these facilities are really just breeding grounds for all kinds of disease, zoonotic or otherwise. And so we're very concerned at the Trump order. We absolutely think it's an irresponsible measure at this juncture. And these workers really shouldn't be given a death sentence to go back to work. And we would actually claim that a meat shortage does not equal a food shortage at this juncture.
Grants or loans? That is the debate in the European Union as nations hardest hit by the coronavirus plan a route to recovery. Italy, which has the second highest death rate behind the United States, and also Spain, they want grants. It's not difficult to see why loans would increase their debt burden. Italy's debt currently stands at 130% of gross domestic product. It's expected to rise to 160% due to the crisis. European nations have spent more than 1.8 trillion euros on tackling the pandemic. But the economy is expected to contract by 7.5%. That's according to the International Monetary Fund. The EU has agreed a €1 trillion fund to help nations, but the details have been kicked into the long grass of summer. Right now, we have a panel of experts together to talk through how the European Union is handling all of this. Joining us via Skype from Chislehurst is Lorenzo Cardone, chief economist at Macro Advisors, and via Skype from Madrid, Michael Reed, senior editor at The Economist. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me. So I'm going to start with you, Lorenzo. What do you make of the way the EU is handling this crisis?
If you keep in mind that Europe, unfortunately, has experience in crisis management, back in 2008, 2009, and in 2011, it took 1 or 2 years to come up with new institutions, new tools to respond to the crisis. Today, in a couple of months, effectively, there is already a policy response in place. So although the initial response was pretty slow, I think by now, European institutions have responded in an appropriate way.
And Michael, let's talk about Spain specifically. Slowly, some of the lockdown restrictions are starting to be eased. What kind of damage has been done to the economy there because of the coronavirus?
That's right. The very strict lockdown we've had for the past 7 weeks, the government announced a couple of days ago a gradual plan to relax it over the next 2 months. I mean, the damage to the economy has already been huge. This morning, the Statistics Institute released its estimate for the economy in the first quarter of this year, and it reckons that it contracted by more than 5%. I mean, we'll have to see what happens and how quickly things get back to normal, but the estimates for the contraction this year range from, the realistic estimates range from 8 to 15%, and I think it's probably going to be around 10 to 13%. Why is Spain being hit harder, probably, economically? I think for 2 reasons. One, because the economy is very dependent on foreign tourism. Last year, some 82 million foreigners came on holiday, came to Spain for their holidays, and that industry accounts for 10, 12% of the economy as a whole. Now, because of the restrictions and because of the closure of air borders, which can only be lifted in a coordinated way, most of that revenue will be lost this year. And then the other reason is that the economy has a lot of small and very small businesses, and the fear is that quite a lot of them won't be able to reopen and come back.
Lorenzo, that's a pretty catastrophic situation that he's describing there, that type of contraction. So Spain and Italy are asking for grants. They don't want to have to pay back loans. Do you think they will actually get grants?
They will get some grants. In other words, keep in mind that the current policy response for the recovery fund is linked to the European budget, the multi-annual financial framework, which will be scaled up, probably double the contribution by countries, and that will be used to split the amount between grants and loans. And then the loans can be leveraged up and achieve a decent size. Grants can only be a small part of it. So I think there will be grants for specific reasons within the European budget. but I would not expect a massive amount. Finally, I have to say I fully agree with the other commentator that Spain will be hardly hit, Italy will be hardly hit as well, and many other countries. But as we stand today, it's not clear which country will be affected the most, because some maybe Northern European countries that seems to be less affected today, given that they are very open economies, open to the global trade, they might suffer at least as much as Southern European countries. So it's not clear ex ante who is going to have most solidarity, so to speak, who should benefit from solidarity.
So
because I think the end result might be different.
So, and that's a great point, actually. That gets me to the next topic that I wanted to broach. Michael, specifically, so Germany and some other countries aren't, at least appear not to be in as bad a shape as Italy and Spain and various other countries. Basically, they're saying, we're not necessarily all suffering the same. We shouldn't necessarily have shared responsibility for the debt. Do you think that there's going that type of sentiment is going to increase?
Well, that has been the position of Germany and Northern Europe, and I don't think on the principal issue of can you have mutualized debt, as it's called, so-called Corona bonds or not, I don't think they're going to shift. I mean, the Spanish government's position has been that ideally they would like those Corona bonds. They already have a public debt burden of 95% of GDP. But I think they know they're not going to get them. So they put forward another argument, which is that they want to see a big increase in the European budget, as Lorenzo was mentioning. And they would get, because of the nature of the impact so far, and Lorenzo is right, we don't know what it's going to look like in the end, but so far, they would get quite a lot of those funds from the budget because of the high structural unemployment and because of the impact on tourism, for example. And you know what they are concerned about, and officials here say they want to see two things. First, they want to see a response on a scale of the shock. So they're worried about undershooting in the jargon. And secondly, they point out, reasonably enough, that some countries are in a position to give much bigger aid, much bigger sums of money in aid to their businesses, like Germany, than others. And you know, they argue that distorts the working of the European single market. So I don't think they intend to die in a ditch over Eurobonds, but what they do want is a big response through the budget on top of the mechanisms through the European Central Bank and the stability mechanism.
So one more question for you, Lorenzo. The banking system, how likely is it to stand up to all of this bad debt?
This is a very good question. I think let me first say that there are good news in a sense that the European and specifically the Italian banking sector are much in a much better position today to withstand the crisis than a few years ago. Why is that? Because companies, banks have been recapitalized, and that certainly makes the system more solid. On top of that, I think the policy response by the ECB this time has been very appropriate in my view. So basically easing capital requirements, which makes for the banks a lot of sense at the moment, because that allows them to extend credit to the economy. And finally, I think governments have introduced almost everywhere guarantees to support lending to companies. This overall should put the banks in a much better position to withstand the crisis. Having said that, inevitably, with the sharp contraction in the economy, with the inevitable default of some companies, there will be an increase of non-performing loans. And that will be true for Italy and many other countries. So some banks will suffer, inevitably.
Okay, that'll be the final word on this. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the conversation. We appreciate it. Lorenzo Codogno and Michael Reed. Thank you both. And that is our show for this week. To get in touch with us anytime, you can tweet me at Rochelle Carey. Please use the hashtag AJCTC when you do that. Drop us an email as well. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net. That is our address. Very easy to find. But there is more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page. There's individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Rochelle Carey from the entire team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.